With the Switch, Nintendo is back with a bang and in the big time again. Everything is looking up for them. Given the success of the Switch, it's no surprise that many media outlets and individual gamers have begun to compare the two biggest games on the system, Zelda Breath of the Wild and Mario Odyssey. Some are naturally asking which game is better and which game has been the killer app that has been helping to sell the Switch. Now, given all this attention on these two big franchises, I began to wonder a slightly bigger question. Which franchise, Mario or Zelda, has been Nintendo's MVP, not just recently, but over the last 3 decades? The conventional wisdom, of course, says that it's Mario, but I wanted to really dig into the statistics and crunch the numbers behind that sentiment so that I can answer the question beyond a shadow of a doubt, at least for myself. Which is Nintendo's all-time MVP franchise, Zelda or Mario? I'm going to look at the historical Nintendo landscape before Breath of the Wild and Mario Odyssey, before the Switch, and I'll be looking at the good times and the bad. I'm going to look at the major Mario and Zelda releases that came out on Nintendo consoles between 1985 and 2013. This will not include handheld games, so no Game Boy or 3DS stuff, even though some of those games are absolutely brilliant. Now for Mario, this will include the 12 major Super Mario games in the series, not including the more tertiary stuff like Mario Tennis, Mario Party, those kinds of things. I'm just talking about the mainline console releases, from Super Mario Bros. 1 on the original Nintendo to Super Mario 3D World on the Wii U. And as for Zelda, it will include the 9 major Zelda console releases, from The Legend of Zelda on the original Nintendo to Skyward Sword on the Wii. Now, in comparing the two franchises, I'm going to dig into the statistics from a number of different angles. I'm going to look at game sales across a variety of categories and from a number of different perspectives. But beyond that, I'm also going to look at contextual information. Which games were released during critical periods for Nintendo and either boosted the company to new heights or steadied the ship during times of scary and crushing competition. And as an added bonus, at the end of this video, even though it has nothing to do with being an MVP, I'm going to take a fun look at the trends in game length between the two franchises. The most obvious place to start in this analysis is to compare total franchise sales. Collectively, the 12 Mario games in this analysis sold just shy of 170 million copies. By comparison, the 9 Zelda games in the analysis collectively sold nearly 43 million copies. Now, this is why my first thought, and probably your first thought, is that Mario is the obvious MVP. It's the knee-jerk reaction. The numbers here are staggering, and quite frankly not even close. But you'll see that as we go deeper and deeper into the statistics, as well as layering in some contextual information, it's not quite as one-sided as this graphic initially makes it seem. First, let's move on to averages to level the field a little bit, since Mario has 3 extra games in this analysis. The average Mario entry sold just over 14 million copies versus the average Zelda game selling nearly 5 million. So again, Mario looks amazing. Still, let's factor in something else that is critical. The original Mario on the first Nintendo and Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo were both pack-ins, so we need to control for that. Now, while it's true that some other games were also packed in with some versions of consoles, like Super Mario 3 for instance, those other games weren't launch titles like Super Mario 1 and Super Mario World. So the exaggerated sales from being bundled with some special edition of the system wouldn't be as dramatic as with these two. So let's take those 2 games out of the analysis and see how things shake out. Now average sales for Mario games dropped to about 10.8 million. Still more than double the average Zelda game, simply amazing. Although I don't think you'd find a single company in the industry that would turn down a franchise with average sales of nearly 5 million copies over the last 3 decades. And how would you like to be a company with 2 franchises that you can assume will sell between 5 and 10 million copies on average? These 2 must be a very nice safety net to have. Let's switch the conversation to individual systems and look at how the 2 franchises stack up on each console. Average sales for Mario games on the first Nintendo were nearly 22 million copies versus an average of about 5.5 between the 2 Zelda games that were on the system. On the Super Nintendo, the two Mario games on that system averaged 12.3 million in sales versus the 4.6 million that the single Zelda game sold. But put the brakes on for a moment and let's again remove the original Mario Bros. Game and the Super Mario World on Super Nintendo. Now we see that the gap is closed quite a bit on the Nintendo, so that Mario is about double the Zelda sales. And on the Super Nintendo, Zelda actually goes slightly ahead. Besides the Super Nintendo, Mario edges Zelda across the board on the other systems by at least a 2-to-1 ratio. But keep Nintendo 64 and Gamecube in mind as we move forward with the analysis, because some interesting things are going to happen. The Wii U obviously isn't a fair comparison because I'm not including Breath of the Wild sales on the Wii U, therefore there is no Zelda game on the Wii U for this analysis. Now here let's take a look at individual game sales ranked from highest to lowest, and we see that the Mario games are by and large stacked on top of the Zelda games. In fact, 8 of the top 10 sellers on this graphic are Mario games. However, Ocarina of Time on the 64 did manage to hit the number 8 spot, and that's something we're going to come back to when we consider context later in this video. So keep that in mind for now. Before we move on to another criteria, let's throw all of these games on a scatter plot relative to time and see if we can make out any trends. First, the 12 Mario games. And each of the blue dots on this graphic is a Mario game. And as we go from left to right, we're moving from 1985 with Super Mario 1 right there to 2013 with Super Mario 3D World right there. Now, do you see any kind of trend there? I don't know, it's hard to say, right? Let's throw the 9 Zelda games up on this same scatter plot. Although constantly lower, it looks to me that the Zelda games are a lot more consistent in their sales levels. That almost looks like a straight line at around the 5 million sales level mark, possibly indicating a more stable and consistent audience in a way for Zelda. Again, it's hard to draw any definitive conclusions from this, but it's fascinating to look at. Let's move on from sales. One of the big news stories recently was that Breath of the Wild at one point had a 102% attach rate to the Switch, meaning that more people bought the game than had actually bought the Switch. Now, Nintendo explained that this was likely due to some people buying collector's editions to collect, and a second copy of the game to break open and actually play, therefore putting more games out there than there were systems. Now, this inspired me to take a look at the historic attach rate of these two franchises. And just to be clear, when I say attach rate, I'm talking about the total number of a particular game that was sold divided by the total number of systems that were sold that that game plays on. So let's run through a real-world example with this just to illustrate how it works. The Nintendo 64 sold 32.9 million consoles. Now the game Mario 64 sold 11.6 million copies. So 11.6 million divided by 32.9 million gives us an attach rate for Mario 64 of 35%, meaning that just over a third of Nintendo 64s have a Mario 64 attached. Or said slightly differently, just over a third of Nintendo 64 owners have Mario 64 in their collection. Here are the average attach rates for the 12 Mario and 9 Zelda games. Mario has a nearly 30% average attach rate across all systems, while Zelda is just at about 11%. But again, let's take away those two pack-ins, Mario 1 and Super Mario World. This brings Mario's attach rate down to 24.6%. Now, neither of these numbers are anything to sneeze at, and I doubt that you would find many other franchises that have these kinds of attach rates across a 30-year period. Moving on to average attach rates by franchise and by system, we see some more impressive stuff. First, the attach rates for Mario games on Nintendo and Super Nintendo are really high, at 34 and 25% respectively. But take away those two pack-ins again, and now we see that the Mario attach rate drops to 19% on the Nintendo and 8% on the Super Nintendo. We'll get to the Nintendo 64 and Gamecube games in a minute when I discuss individual games, but let's skip ahead of those for now. The 3 Mario games on the Wii had a similar attach rate to the Mario games on the original Nintendo, but take a look at the Wii U average attach rate for the 2 Mario games that were released on that system. 42%. I have a feeling that might say more about the state of the Wii U than the specific power of those Mario games, but I'm not sure. From the perspective of individual games, there are a few noteworthy entries in both franchises. Of course, we're going to skip over Super Mario 1 because it came bundled in so many consoles. And despite what I might have just said about the Wii U, I think it's still massively impressive that Super Mario 3D World had a massive 42% attach rate, meaning that nearly half of all Wii U console owners owned that game. And the reason I think it's so impressive is because this was not a launch title. It came out a year after the Wii U had been released, unlike, for example, Mario 64, which was a launch title, and not only that, back in September of '96 when it came out, it was one of just a couple of games that were available for the system. It's no wonder that the attach rate is at 35% for that game. Now, I think most impressive of all is Ocarina of Time, a game that came out in 1998 at a time when there would have been plenty to choose from on the Nintendo 64, and yet still managed to have 25% of system owners pick up the game. Those are convincing numbers. I'm really surprised to see that Super Mario World 2 on the Super Nintendo only had an attach rate of 8%. This could be indicative of Nintendo's overall standing in the changing world of 1995. Recall that this was the start of the PlayStation era, and maybe people were just trailing away from the Super Nintendo in general at that time. Everything in this video so far, with the exception of a couple of sentences in that last section, have been without real context. That's to say that this stuff has been stated without consideration to the landscape at the time. Games aren't released in a vacuum. Things are always happening around them. So let's jump out of that vacuum and into the landscape, if only for a brief excursion. Now this is the timeline of major systems from the Atari 2600 to the current generation systems. Here are where the 12 major Mario Bros. Releases land on that timeline. It's interesting to see the relative dry spell that occurred from about 1990 to 2005 with Mario. Now that we have all of the little Marios in front of us, let's take a look at some of the key points in time. Of course, Mario 1 in 1985 was good. It had to be good. And it was on the back of that game that the Nintendo brand was really launched. For that reason, this Mario is a critical Mario on this historic landscape. Mario 2 and 3 were important, no doubt, but by then Nintendo had established itself and had yet to face any real stiff competition. Next up, Super Mario World I consider another key game. This was at a time when the Genesis was breathing down Nintendo's neck, and they needed a great game to come out of the gate with the Super Nintendo, and Mario obliged. Now by 1996, Nintendo was looking like it was losing its grip on the industry. The Nintendo 64 needed something big to give itself a foothold again, and at least start the climb back to the top. And Mario 64 gave them what they needed when they needed it. It was a steady ship that allowed them to navigate some scary seas through the rest of the 90s. The next Mario launch title wouldn't come out for another 3 systems. New Super Mario Bros. U on the Wii U. Now let's turn the page and populate the timeline with all of the little links. Now I believe that the first Legend of Zelda on the Nintendo helped Nintendo to establish itself as a must-have device back in 1986. However, I can't say that it would have had the same importance as Mario 1. Likewise, the next Nintendo Zelda and the Zelda on the Super Nintendo were likely not as critical to Nintendo's success as Mario was. Those games were always a few steps behind after Mario had already done the very heavy lifting to get things going. Now the 32 and 64-bit era gets interesting. Recall that this is where Nintendo's stormy seas began, when Sony crashed the China shop and panicked the industry's old sensibilities like a massive bull. If Mario 64 was a steady ship for Nintendo, then the 2 Zelda games on the 64 were Nintendo's life jackets, especially Ocarina of Time. When it was released, it was universally hailed as something special and incredible. Consumers flocked to it during a time when PlayStation was brutalizing the competition. I believe that the 2 64-bit Zelda entries were absolutely critical to Nintendo. And then fast forward to 2006, and the tables turn as Zelda is actually a launch title for the first time, with Twilight Princess on the Wii. And we all remember how insanely successful the Wii was. When we smash these 2 timelines next to each other, you can almost see the tide turning in a very slight way. Mario was and continues to be incredibly important to Nintendo. No question about that, and nothing will ever take that away. But the argument could be made that Zelda has slowly begun to become more and more important to the company as time goes on. And with Breath of the Wild having been a Nintendo Switch launch title, the franchise really could be giving Mario a run for its money in a short while. Now, I really love both of these franchises. I've put so many hours into them, it's insane. But like the immortals say in Highlander, there can be only one. Now, the massive sales, the big attach rates, the importance of establishing and steadying Nintendo during rough times, it's all really pointing in one direction for now. The tide might be turning, especially if you look at contextual information regarding more recent history, but for now, it really is still all about Mario. He is the all-time reigning, defending, and conquering MVP of Nintendo. And maybe if we did this analysis again 5 years from now, things might look different. I really hope that I can do that analysis. Before we leave off, I just want to bring up one more measure. And this doesn't have anything to do with who's the MVP, it's just interesting and fun, at least for a statistics enthusiast like me. And I guess if you've made it this far, then like you too. According to howlongtobeat.com, the average time to beat the 12 Mario games in this analysis is 9.3 hours. The average Zelda game, on the other hand, is 22.4 hours. Now let's compare apples to apples. If we look at individual Mario games over time, again, where every blue dot you see here is a Mario game, we see that the franchise was introducing games that took longer and longer to beat until about 2002 with Mario Sunshine. And since then, it's been headed on somewhat of a downward trend, where they're taking less time to beat. And this data is for how long it takes to get through the story, not talking about collectibles. If we were to add Odyssey to this chart, it would sit right about here, and matches the rough trend line. Now, alternatively, if we take a look at Zelda game length through time, we see a definite upward trend in how long these games are taking to beat. And if we add Breath of the Wild, it would be way up here, at about 45 hours long, continuing that trend. I'm not sure what to make of any of this, if anything. It could certainly be that Nintendo is catering to two very different audiences, and I have heard some critics suggest that Mario is really being tailored to a very young, very new audience. However, a deeper exploration of this would be an entirely new video. In any event, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe if that's something you don't mind doing. I try to add new videos regularly, and until next time, all the best and the sky's the limit.